Believe it or not, London has 25,000 streets, over 20,000 landmarks, and the average driving speed within the city is just 7.2 miles an hour. It's no wonder that over 5 million people travel daily on the London Underground. This railway can be separated into several eras, so today we'll be starting with the Metropolitan Railway. The Industrial Revolution was causing expansion all over the UK in the early 19th century, and London was no exception. The city was growing so quickly that the current transport infrastructure was unable to cope. New railways being built on the outskirts of the city were bringing upwards of 200,000 people daily, many travelling to the inner city by foot on congested, dangerous roads. Many knew the need for an inner city railway, and Parliament was lobbied many times for new lines nearer to the heart of the city. An 1846 Royal Commission banned the construction of any new lines or stations, so if the railway lines couldn't go overground, the only option left was to go under. The idea of an underground railway was conceived as early as the 1830s, but there was little initial interest. Solicitor to the city Charles Pearson was a leading advocate for these new lines and proposed many ideas, but in 1846 all were rejected. 3 major railway companies thought the plan was viable, so they consolidated and the Bayswater, Paddington and the Holborn Railway Company was born. They wanted to establish a connection from the Great Western Railway's new station, Paddington, to King's Cross via a route that Pearson proposed. After appointing John Fowler as the engineer, the company was granted a successful application by Parliament, and with the new venture, the company had a new name, the North Metropolitan Railway. Through careful acquisitions, they were able to extend the proposal to include the General Post Office at St Martin le Grand, Farringdon, the London and North Western Railway, and to the Great North Railway. The company's name was also changed again to the Metropolitan Railway, and the project was given a royal assent. Construction began in 1860. It was considered too dangerous to some existing buildings if the railway just dug underneath them, so they bought as many as they could and demolished them. The railway used a cut and cover method for its tunnels. A large trench was excavated and allowed for the tracks to be laid underneath, and the tunnel and supporting walls were built around them. Once complete, the soil and ground was filled back in and the ground surface reinstated. In one upmarket streak, the local populace were not too happy. The new tunnel went through the up-and-coming Leicester Gardens, some of the most expensive and luxury apartments in the area. Number 23 and 24 were demolished and a tunnel was left in their wake. The neighbours were not best pleased, so to compensate, a fake facade was put in the building's place, which is still hiding the tunnel, even today. The facade also provided the perfect cover for one of the many vents for the spent smoke of the locomotives to escape. It was estimated that over 1,000 homes had to be demolished to accommodate the cut and cover method, with little to no compensation given. Because the Great Western Railway was a considerable backer in the new project, it was only fitting that the railway would accommodate Brunel's broad gauge engines, but they had to accommodate for standard gauge too. They overlaid the broad track and the standard gauge, and both engines could use the railway with ease by the introduction of a third rail. The Metropolitan Railway delivered their first section overdue and over budget. One unforeseen obstacle was also an unusual one. It was not well known, but London sits on more than one river. In fact, it sits on 22 of them. The majority of the rivers have been diverted underground, and the River Fleet was one of them. It diverts into a brick sewer. As the railway was being built alongside, the river burst through the sewer walls and flooded the track. It took over 6 weeks to clear and repair the damage at a considerable cost. Finally, after some final tweaking to the signalling system, the new underground service was ready for its first passengers on the 10th of January 1863. Sadly, it was a sight that Charles Pearson never got to see. He sadly passed away 4 months before the railway opened, but I'm sure he would have been looking over, very proud. Everyone knew that this was going to be a growing project, and the armies of men laboured throughout the 60s to build more and more track. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, and even today many engineers marvel at their work. The new railway was very popular, taking in a very respectable £850 on its first day alone. First class tickets would set you back about 2.5 pence, while second and third would be about 2 and 1.5 pence respectively. By the end of the year, the railway had carried over 1.8 million people and was averaging about 26,500 people per day. The Metropolitan knew that this honeymoon period would not last, so they introduced a new and rather clever incentive. They introduced 2 trains running at each end of the line. The trains would run before 6 a.m. and cater specifically to the working population. The workers would buy a ticket with a promise that they were guaranteed a return train back from work with no extra costs. These return tickets were slightly more expensive than the one-way, but cheaper than buying 2 separate tickets. The marketing ploy worked, and over 70% of the train's passengers consisted of workers, or as they like to call them, commuters. But what of the engines? In the beginning, the Great Western Railway exclusively provided the rolling stock. 45 coaches were provided that ran on the broad gauge track, as well as the 22 specifically built locomotives which had a unique feature which allowed for the spent steam to be channeled back into its own water tanks. But it didn't take long for disagreements to occur between the Metropolitan Railway and the Great Western about the frequency of the engines and the costs. Eventually, the Great Western, fed up with the disagreements, threatened to withdraw all of its stock and engines, and selling to the Metropolitan Railway was not a deal the Great Western was willing to make. Luckily for the new railway, the Great Northern seized the opportunity and offered to lend the Metropolitan 18 standard gauge locomotives. The engines were perfectly designed for the confines of the underground and had similar steam condensers of the Great Western locomotives. The engines were designed by Bayer Peacock in Manchester and were so good the Metropolitan ordered a further 48 locomotives to give the Metropolitan the frequency they wanted on these lines. For 40 years the Peacocks faithfully served the underground lines, and throughout their life there was not one incident that resulted in the loss of a passenger. Considering the frequency of the engines travelled on the lines and the fact that the carriages were wooden and lit by gas, and the sheer numbers of passengers that were travelling, it was astounding. One of the biggest safety features the railway had was use of block signalling and tokens. The Metropolitan expanded exponentially, and with the expansion came new jobs. Additional parliamentary powers were granted, and for the first time the railway was permitted to build a new station within the inner city. As each new station was opened, it prompted new buildings and properties to be built all around them. Moorgate Street, Shepherd's Bush, Nottingham Farms and Latimer Road were the first to get new stations. The Metropolitan was on a roll, and soon the House of Lords had to elect a select committee to decide on the new transport routes. They wanted the new routes to interconnect and form an inner circuit. Of course, the Metropolitan Railway was only too happy to oblige. Soon Tower Hill and Kensington were connected, and a new line from Paddington to Gloucester Road, bypassing Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, was also created. We're now up to 1868, and this is where I'm going to leave it for now. This will be my first ever mini-series, and I will return to this and to look at the District Line and how this company was set to put a spanner in the works for the new railway, and how a new tunnelling method created the first official tube.